Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Capita conversation with Representative Jennifer McClellan. Representative McClellan, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for being with us to have this conversation about flourishing in the face of climate change. First of all, I would like to say healthy, resilient children are the foundation of healthy, resilient communities. And in the last several weeks, the U.S. Early Years Climate Action Task Force, convened by Capita and This is Planet Ed at the Aspen Institute, and of which Representative McClellan was a member, released Flourishing Children, Healthy Communities, and a Stronger Nation, the U.S. Early Years Climate Action Plan. You can view that at www.earlyyearsclimateplan.us. Representative McClellan, first of all, I'd like to just say thank you for making time. It has been an incredible and perhaps incredibly weird few weeks in the United States House of Representatives, but we're grateful that you've taken the time to chat with us today about something that is critically important for our future. Last year, a poll we commissioned and conducted by the Siena College Research Institute found that 72% of Virginians believe climate change is a serious problem facing children under 8, and 36% of Virginians surveyed believe climate change is harming our youngest children now. What are you hearing from your constituents in Virginia about the present day experiences of living with climate disruption?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me this morning. I'm very glad that our chaos, our speaker watch chaos, did not disrupt our conversation. I'm hearing a lot from my constituents of all ages, from my own children who are 8 and 13, and their classmates who worry about the state of the planet now, and that they will grow up and raise their own family in. From parents who are concerned of the impact that climate change is having on their children's health now, whether it's constituents in areas that are overburdened by energy plants or other pollutants that are leading to higher incidence of cancer and asthma, not only for their children, but for entire communities, to people who are worried about the impact of rising temperature and extreme weather events on their day-to-day lives, whether it's scheduling for the school classes or for after-school programs. And I think particularly now in the wake of the COVID pandemic and the disruption that had on our children's lives, now as we are seeing more and more extreme weather events that are also disrupting their lives and their routines, just the mental health impact that is having on our children and our communities, are just to name a few. I mean, we could probably spend the entire half hour just talking about that one question.
Great. Yeah, certainly we could. The Capita Aspen U.S. Early Years Climate Action Task Force argued that climate change is not a separate issue, but the context we are all living with today. How would you like to see federal policymakers reimagine all of our federally funded child and family serving programs and policies, from healthcare programs like CHIP to Head Start and transportation infrastructure, to account for this new context?
Well, I think it's safe to say that traditionally, all governments, not just the federal government — I spent 18 years in state government, I think I see our local governments falling into this trap as well — we tend to legislate and govern in silos and try to separate energy policy, environmental policy, healthcare policy, transportation policy, housing, education, and yet we live interconnected lives. And so each of those issues are interconnected. So when you are doing land use planning, you need to think through how can we build a community where the decisions we make on siting of, whether it's energy plants, transportation infrastructure, thinking through how is that going to impact our communities today and in the future, while also thinking through, we are living with the impacts of climate change now, so we have to build resiliency and mitigation into all of our plans, whether it's building a new school or childcare center or hospital, and also recognizing that with extreme weather events, with rising climates, with migration of whether it's plants, animals, or organisms, that diseases we thought we were done with may be coming back. And so we really need to think holistically about how all of these issues are interconnected, because in our everyday lives, they're interconnected and how they impact us.
You just recently came to Washington and joined the Congress. As you said, you were in the state Senate in Virginia for a number of years. And one of the first pieces of legislation you introduced when you got to Washington was the Child Care Assistance for Maternal Health Act. This is a bipartisan piece of legislation intended, as I understand it, to support mothers and families during pregnancy, childbirth, and postpartum. Why was it important to you to make this one of the first pieces of legislation you introduced in Congress?
Well, first of all, I am part of a very small club here in Congress. Less than 7% of the 118th Congress are mothers of children under the age of 18. Less than 3% of Congress are women, mothers of color of children under the age of 18. And I am in both of those very small clubs. I actually became a mother after I was elected to office. And so I saw firsthand a number of things. First, how difficult it is to get early childhood education and childcare. Two, how important it is to lay a foundation for education and for development. They call a lot of times child development centers, or what they call daycare, because they're not just babysitting, they are helping to develop that child, because we know that 80% of their brain is developed before the age of 3, 90% before the age of 5. And so you really are laying the foundation for successful K-12 education. I saw all of that firsthand. I also, as someone who almost died in childbirth, have seen firsthand the crisis that maternal mortality is in our communities generally, but specifically for women of color. And most women die within the first year of postpartum. And there are a number of factors going on. What this bill intends to do is help take some of the stress off of new mothers in the postpartum period by making sure we are going to make it easier for you to find childcare for that, whether it's for your new child or for one, an older child, so that you have the time to take care of your recovery. People forget childbirth is a medical event that the mother needs to recover from. And in my case, having emergency C-section, I needed more than 8 weeks to recover. But you also need the time to de-stress, because if you've got, again, I almost died with my second child. I had a 4-year-old in the house at the same time. And the stress of having one child in a NICU and another one at home and having to take care of myself, sometimes that can be too much. So this bill is designed to make sure we are really prioritizing and helping provide, whether it's through grants or other resources, providing access to childcare in that critical postpartum period.
Great, thank you. And thank you for sharing your own story and experience as part of that. Just a note, if you're joining us today, either here on the webinar or via YouTube, we do not have a formal question and answer period with the Congresswoman, but if you have questions, feel free to put them in and I will try and incorporate them as possible in our remaining time. Congresswoman, the House's work has essentially stopped, as we alluded to earlier, over the last 3 weeks since Speaker McCarthy was voted out of office. Why should Americans trust Congress to take action on critical priorities, both for Virginians, your constituents, and for people across the country?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to remember that in a government by, of, and for the people, the government will reflect the perspectives and priorities of, and therefore meet the needs of the people who participate. And that's not just the people who run for office. That is the people who are holding us accountable, who vote, but also who on a day-to-day basis are letting us know, hey, these are my priorities as your constituents. These are the issues I expect you to focus on, and these are the problems I expect you to solve. Because that's our number one job, is to help people and solve problems. Right now, it may appear not to be working, but you ultimately have the power to hold us accountable and make sure that you are demanding that we address the issues that are important to you. And I fundamentally believe in our democracy. It's not perfect. No government is perfect, but it's the best form that we've had in all of these years. And I think there are examples throughout history where we've gotten it right, where when something reaches a critical mass of demand from the people that we address it. But we've got to have that input from you, the people, to make sure that we are hearing your perspective and we are therefore meeting your needs.
That I think well said, and certainly a call to all of us to become even more engaged, and maybe even in this period to be calling our members of Congress and asking that they take up these critical priorities. This is likely the first year in that most first-time births in the United States are to Gen Z mothers, and we define that as moms born themselves since January 1st, 1997. We know that Gen Z is as lonely as any generation and anxious about the future, and they're particularly anxious about climate change. As this next generation graduates from high school, college, enters the workforce, and become parents themselves, how should Congress and maybe even the federal government and government at large think about better supporting them, despite them, frankly, not having as much political power as baby boomers and members of Gen X?
So as a member of Gen X, I will say that you are not just, Gen Z is not just our future, you're our present leaders. And we have now a member of Gen Z in Congress, in Maxwell Frost, and we've seen many more who are running for office and getting elected all across the country. I think, again, it is really important that you make your voice heard, no matter what generation you're in. And I think it's critically important. Look, Congress does not reflect the full diversity of this country. Most state governments don't either. But you have the power through your vote, through your voice, to make your perspective heard. And I think it's really important. Everybody's political views, their policy views, how they vote, is shaped by their life experiences and what they know. If you're not sharing your life experiences, either through testifying at hearings, talking to your member of Congress, or again, in some cases, running for office yourself, your perspective won't be heard and your needs won't be met. That's a simple fact, as old as this government is. And I think making sure that you remember that, and that your vote is your power, your voice is your power in this democracy. You can make sure your voice is heard. Now, for us in Congress, we need to get out of our offices and in our communities and listen and talk to people and meet them where they are. And sometimes we're good at that and sometimes we're not, but it's a two-way conversation. And so we need to meet you where you are, but you also need to be willing to be there to talk to us. And in some cases, come out of your comfort zone to come and talk to a policymaker about, look, this is practically how what you are doing or not doing is impacting my life and my future, and be vocal about it. And I have no doubt Gen Z will be vocal about it. I have a 13-year-old son. I have a niece and a nephew who are in Gen Z, and they are vocal. And we have seen, whether it's through protests, whether it's through voting, that Gen Z is not going to be shy about making its voice heard. So just keep it up.
Mm-hmm. So climate change is one of those issues that members of Generation Z have said that they're concerned about. You referenced this earlier too. Mental health is another one of those. What would you like to see Congress do on mental health policy during your service in Congress?
Couple of things. First, recognize that mental health is just one other component of healthcare generally. And again, don't silo it. Mental health is just as big an issue as heart health. And we have got to fully fund our infrastructure. We don't have enough mental health providers. We need mental health providers, not just in a clinical setting, but in our schools. And as a state legislator, I worked very hard to make sure that we had a pipeline of getting mental health services in our schools, in our communities. Congress needs to do its job to help pay for that as well, and help to get more people in the pipeline for the mental health workforce. I think those are the two biggest issues. But we also need to make sure that for Medicaid reimbursements in general, but particularly for mental health providers, have got to increase so that we get more people taking Medicaid patients and not losing money as a result.
Right. And on that, I'm just curious, what is the right mix? You coming out of state government, now serving in federal government, what is the right mix of federal and state leadership on this issue in particular?
I don't know that there's necessarily, I mean, it has to be a partnership, and I throw local government in there as well. We are all partners and we all have a role to play because we have different sets of powers and different responsibilities. And I think the more we view ourselves as partners who are working hand in hand, and not just I'm over in my silo doing my thing and you're in your silo doing your thing, that's critically important. And government can't fix everything alone. We've got to work with the private sector. We've got to work with the nonprofit communities. We've got to work with our schools and our hospitals and our communities to make sure that we are all working together, focusing on identifying where are the most critical needs and who is the best entity to address those needs. But usually it's going to be all of us working together.
As a legislator, you have, I can only imagine, you have many pressing demands on your time and your attention. Despite those demands, how are you remaining focused? And here I'd love to know even some of your personal habits to remain focused on the country's long-term health and well-being.
My kids help keep me there. I think as the first Black woman elected to Congress from Virginia, a lot of ways I recognize I'm fighting the same fights that my parents, my grandparents, and my great-grandparents fought. But I fight those fights so that my children and their children don't have to, whether it's climate change, whether it's voting rights, whether it's access to childcare or a high-quality public education. I have a full view of our history as a country, where we've come from, how our past still impacts our present, and how we've got to shape that present to shape the future, and whether we're meeting the needs of our current and future generations. And at the end of the day, my children keep that foremost in my mind. So they keep me grounded.
And I'd love to know, like, I can imagine the ways that they keep you grounded. Are they giving you policy advice too?
Sometimes, yes. More often than not, though, they just remind me at the end of the day, you may have representative before your title, but to us, you're just mommy. And I think they help keep my feet on the ground more than anything. But they also keep me connected to what their generation is facing and concerned about. So it's not theoretical to me. I mean, I've got my little focus group right there. But between them and their friends and other members of my family and my community, it keeps foremost in my mind why I'm doing this job. I'm not in this job just to get policy wins. I'm in this job to help my community and help solve problems. And they help me see those problems from a different perspective than my own as a member of Gen X, Congresswoman.
Right. One thing I love to ask anybody that I interview, and I'm going to ask you now, is what is one project you've dreamed of but haven't started yet? And maybe this is a project specifically for your time in Congress, however long or short it might be?
Oh, there's so many. I don't I don't know how to answer that. I, frankly, I'm gonna say that project is probably gonna be writing a book that really captures my service and what was the point, frankly. What was the point? Because a lot of people wonder, what's the point of government? What's the point of public service? And I can't answer that for everybody, but I can share my public service journey and the impact that it has had on my community. Hopefully I've got a long time to go before I've got to write it, but that might be my project, is how my service has impacted my community and my country.
That's great. And what would help you, whether it's from civil society leaders or advocates, your constituents, or from Congress itself, what would help you remain more focused, better focused on achieving long-term sustainable wins, like meaningfully addressing climate disruption?
I think first pausing to celebrate our victories, because we've had many, whether it's the IIJA and the Inflation Reduction Act and the historic investments in addressing climate change, whether it's the Virginia Clean Economy Act, back when I was a state senator. We have had extraordinary victories. So pause and celebrate it, but then focus on how do we build from that and how do we keep going. I think sometimes policymakers and advocates, we let the enemy be the perfect of the good, and we focus on what we failed to do rather than celebrating what we accomplished and then using that to fuel our ability to go even further. So I think that would help tremendously, but also I'll keep saying it like a broken record: make your voice heard. Make sure that you are not just coming here to have a seat at the table, but you're forcing us as members of Congress to bring the table out into our communities, and that you are helping us to see the connection between the debates that we have here and the bills that we are debating and what's going on in your communities. You have the power to do that. You have the power to shape our policy because you're in the trenches, and making sure we hear from you on a regular basis is critically important.
Great, thank you. Congresswoman, I would, as a final question, I would love to just hear from you what your dreams, hopes, aspirations for the U.S. Early Years Climate Action Plan are. If it is successful, if we are successful with it, what maybe do you hope is true about our country 5 years from now that wasn't true when we began the process of which you were a part last year?
I think big picture, that we are finally starting to develop an integrated public policy that recognizes that early childhood education, environmental policy, transportation policy, housing policy, healthcare policy are all interconnected, and that we are thinking through not just how do I react to what's happening in my community today, but how do I plan for the future so that the policies I put in place are meeting the needs of future generations that haven't been born yet. We are terrible about doing that as a government. And I think if we do nothing else, get us more being proactive than reactive as a government on these issues, and thinking more holistically, then it will have been a success. There are lots of specific issues, like if we put a lot of the recommendations into action, that's the win-win-win. But at a minimum, if we can just change the thinking to be more proactive and holistic, that's a huge accomplishment.
Mm-hmm. And is there a concrete way? I mean, just you in Congress are thinking about the Biden-Harris administration, and like how can we do that? How can we break down silos to think holistically in what is frankly the largest government that the world has ever seen?
There are lots of ways, big and small. First, I'll give you a very small example. When the Congressional Black Caucus had its legislative conference and each member gets to do a policy issue, my policy forum was focused holistically on the overall health of the Black community. And we talked about environmental justice and mental health and systemic racism, and looked at health broadly and holistically. So beginning to have conversations that way. Another way to do it is by having more, whether they're task force or cabinets that cut across issues. So for example, in Virginia, when we had I forget exactly what we called it, but it was like the children's cabinet, I think, that brought together secretariats and agencies from every secretariat that touched on children, not just the Department of Education, but healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. We can start to do that at the national level to force conversations across secretariats and across agencies on particular community impacts. And that starts with us having those conversations and the Biden-Harris administration having those conversations. I know it's very hard to do, but I'm starting to see those conversations happen.
Yeah. And of course, creating those vehicles, particularly around environmental justice, early childhood, early years, health, education, well-being, is one of the recommendations in the Early Years Climate Action Task Force and Early Years Climate Action Plan made by the task force. And we'd love to see, of course, some of those interagency collaborative bodies move forward on that particular issue. Congresswoman McClellan, we are almost out of time, and I am immensely grateful for the time that you have given us during what is a very undoubtedly busy, but maybe even for you, a sort of hurry up and wait type of week in the United States House of Representatives, but always grateful for your time, energy, and enthusiasm, not only for public service, but for the health, well-being of and flourishing of our youngest children and their families. So thank you very much, Congresswoman Jennifer McClellan, for being with us today.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for watching.
Bye-bye.